one of my biggest bugbears is something that I believed as a school student was true. When we were in school, we were told India's great problem is population. Why are we poor? There are too many people, right? And that is a canard that we were fed. And we were told, hum do, hamare do, and we were taught about population planning and all of those things. And it sounded intuitive to me. Like, of course, we are a poor country, there are too many people, not enough things to go around, right? And that's what I believed then. And over the years, as I realized, perhaps coming into adulthood, that this was a canard, the opposite was true, I got angrier and angrier, and most people still believe this and refuse to, adjust their views to the facts. So here's my contention and an argument I want to make. My argument is that people are brains, not stomachs. Welcome to Everything is Everything. I'm Amit. This is my good friend Shah. This is the Amit and Shah show. This is Everything is Everything. Don't worry about it. And so, Ajay, matching.
What spontaneous banter can we do about this spontaneous order?
Now you're kind of putting pressure. But you know what your shirt reminds me of? The design on your shirt?
Yeah?
Maggots on a dead cow.
Ooh,
I will explain.
please do explain.
So, I have wanted to do an episode about this for a long time. I've written a number of columns about it. One of my biggest bugbears is something that I believed as a school student was true. When we were in school, we were told India's great problem is population. Why are we poor? There are too many people, right? And that is a canard that we were fed. And we were told, hum do, hamare do, and we were taught about population planning and all of those things. And it sounded intuitive to me. Like, of course, we are a poor country, there are too many people, not enough things to go around, right? And that's what I believed then. And over the years, as I realized, perhaps coming into adulthood, that this was a canard, the opposite was true, I got angrier and angrier, and most people still believe this and refuse to, adjust their views to the facts. So here's my contention and an argument I want to make. My argument is that people are brains, not stomachs, right? And I want to begin by citing a 2007 study called Too Many People by Nicholas Everstart. And Everstart really looked at all the data and found out that there is no correlation between population density and poverty. On the contrary, it's the other way around. And we might look at common examples and say, oh, Bangladesh is poor because they are so crowded. But he points out that Monaco has 40 times the population density of Bangladesh and is far richer. He points out that Bahrain has 3 times the population density of India and is far richer than us, right? And you don't even need to look at the data. You need to use common sense. If too many people are a bad thing, if population density is a bad thing, then people should be moving to get away to places where there are less people. But the whole story of humanity, all of human history, is about migrating from sparsely populated rural areas to cities with dense populations. It is not that people from Mumbai are going to Bihar and UP, people from Delhi are going to Uttaranchal. It is the other way around, and it is the other way around because people are brains, not stomachs. More people mean greater networks, more positive sum games, more double thank you moments. So that for me has been sort of a profound realization, and one that I care about deeply, because believing that people are a problem has deep consequences, and it has deep humanitarian consequences, and we'll talk about some of them now. But I feel it also has moral consequences for a society, because anyone who says population is a problem, what is he saying? He's saying that other people are a problem. I am not. I am above all of this. And this breeds a sort of attitude that I just find obnoxious. A great book on this subject is a great phrasing of what I feel about this is something that, the economist Julian Simon once used. Julian Simon wrote this great book called The Ultimate Resource. Came out in 1981. There's a second edition of that also. And the argument is, what is the ultimate resource? Human beings are the ultimate resource. Again, going back to people being brains, not stomachs. And everyone who, whenever people say, oh, but where does our poverty come from, where does X come from, where does Y come from, all the things that we ascribe to population, although all our problems are really, in my mind, they're failures of governance. And I find that we need to take a deeper look within another sort of illustration of human beings being the ultimate resource is a figure that both you and I know really well, that poor people have more children. And why do poor people have more children? Because they are viewing children as resources. Part of it, of course, is also an adjacent fact is childhood mortality is higher among the poor, so it's a form of insurance. But even with childhood mortality having come down significantly, the poor tend to have more kids, the rich tend to have less kids, and there's also something to think about there.
So, how did we get to that 1960s and 1970s pessimistic view about population?
We got to that view really. These are called Malthusian views, and it's used as a pejorative term. Yeah, the seminal starting point for these views really comes from 1798, where a guy called Robert Malthus wrote an essay called An Essay Concerning the Principle of Population. And his argument was simple. His argument was resources grow arithmetically, people grow exponentially. Therefore, at some point, there will be so many people that there won't be enough resources, and we're all going to starve, and terrible things will happen. And we should avert these terrible things. In fact, at one point in that famous essay, he writes, instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits and quote the return of the plague. Right? Because for him, the plague would be deliverance. Many people would die, and therefore the population problem would be solved. Now, this kind of thinking, continued over the years. In the 20th century, there was an influential man called Harrison Brown, widely acclaimed during his time, wrote a famous book, and at one point he wrote, quote, humanity will not rest content until the earth is covered completely and to a considerable depth with a writhing mass of human beings, much as a dead cow is covered with a pulsating mass of maggots. So now you get where my reference was from. And he was all for forcible sterilization and eugenics and all of that to kind of control the population. And so you had thinkers like this coming up continuously over the years. But in modern times, it really became, I don't want to use the word bomb, but that's coming to my mind because the big moment in modern times was a 1967 book by a guy called Paul Ehrlich called The Population Bomb. And I want to read out the beginning of the book for you. Mind you, it's 1967, right? And this is how the book begins. The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 70s and 80s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate. Right? This is his hardcore prognostication. And at one point, he is writing about Delhi, and this is what he writes. I have understood the population explosion intellectually for a long time. I came to understand it emotionally one stinking hot day in Delhi a few years ago. My wife and daughter and I were returning to our hotel in an ancient taxi. The seats were hopping with fleas. The only functional gear was stirred. As we crawled through the city, we entered a crowded slum area. The temperature was well over 100, and the air was a haze of dust and smoke. The streets seemed alive with people. People eating, people washing, people sleeping, people visiting, arguing and screaming, people thrusting their hands through the taxi window begging, people defecating and urinating, people clinging to buses, people herding animals, people. As we moved slowly through the mob, hand horns squawking, the dust, noise, heat and cooking fires gave the scene a hellish aspect. Would we ever get to our hotel? And I'm pleased to report he did get to his hotel. And later in his book, he wrote about India. I don't see how India could possibly feed 200 million more people by 1980. Right? And in a 1969 article, he wrote, most of the people who are going to die in the greatest cataclysm in the history of man have already been born. Right? So it was extremely drastic, and it was drawn from sort of extrapolating basic figures. Like if the world population doubled between so and so, it will continue doubling, At one point he said something like there will be 70 billion people on Earth, and he's calculating the space they will occupy and how they will visit each other with elevators because there'll be no roads. And he's going through all that nonsense, no doubt, to make a point. But anyone statistically knows that you cannot extrapolate a trend and assume that it will continue forever. Like an example Julian gave was that he showed how the trend of university buildings expanding over the last 5 years, if that trend continue, one day there would be nothing on the earth except university buildings. But obviously common sense will tell you that that never kind of happens. And but this sort of thinking really took hold because it is intuitive. We think of the world in zero-sum ways, and we don't realize that human beings possess countless ingenuity, that we will always find a way to make better use of resources. In fact, if resources ever grow scarce, the price system brings everything back under control. You find alternate ways to achieve the same thing, as in the case of fuel sources, etc., etc. Right? But over the 50s and 60s, before Ehrlich's book, to be honest, over the 50s, 60s, 70s, there were these rising population control movements happening. The Rockefeller Foundation was at the forefront of it, the Ford Foundation, and especially, when it came to India. And at one point, Charles Mann, writes in an essay, in Egypt, Tunisia, Pakistan, South Korea, and Taiwan, health workers' salaries were, in a system that invited abuse, dictated by the number of IUDs they inserted into women. In the Philippines, birth control pills were literally pished out of helicopters hovering over remote villages. Millions of people were sterilized, often coercively, sometimes illegally, frequently in unsafe conditions, in Mexico, Bolivia, Peru, Indonesia, and Bangladesh. Now I want to turn to India. We are familiar with family planning, hum do hamare do. It is a part of our history. And I want to turn to what I think and will be one of my recommendations for this episode, this great book called The Emergency, A Personal History by Kumi Kapoor. Right? She's a great journalist. She's also been on the scene and the unseen. And she has a chapter there on Sanjay Gandhi and family planning. Sanjay Gandhi, in his typical central planning way, went ahead with what the Indian government was already focusing on, family planning. But it was a great way of getting international cred because all your international organizations like Ford Foundation and so on were pushing it in a very hard way. And in her book, she writes about how it completely went out of whack. So let me quote some passages from there. At one point, she writes, and Sanjay was like an extra constitutional authority. So everybody would pretty much take orders from him. There were even rumors at one point that he had slapped Indira when he got angry with her. So Sanjay was a boss, regardless of whatever position he may or may not have held. And all the chief ministers were either chosen by him or they used to listen to him. Bansi Lal of Haryana most notoriously. And Kumi Kapoor writes, ignoring the nodal ministry, Sanjay turned directly to the state chief ministers, most of whom bent over backwards to please the rising sun of the Gandhi dynasty. There were 26.24 lakh sterilizations in 75-76 and a phenomenal 81.32 lakh sterilizations in 76-77. Some eager beaver chief ministers were particularly keen to be counted as overachievers. Haryana outdid itself. The figures showed that in 1976-77, the state had achieved four times its original target. Then there are passages where you get a sense of the incentives involved and what the coercive hand of the state could do. At one point, Kumi Kapoor writes, targets were fixed for each district and each divisional level officer. Failure to meet the target resulted not only in withholding salary payments but even in suspensions and transfers. The district officers in turn passed on the burden of producing the numbers to the police and more junior government employees. Government school teachers and lecturers were convenient scapegoats. They were ordered to motivate at least 5 sterilizations if they expected to be paid their salaries. Some desperate teachers were so frantic to meet their quotas that they offered half their salaries to persuade volunteers to undergo the operation. In some instances, the services of teachers and government employees were terminated. Those who refused to get sterilized were deprived of the festival allowances, housing loans, cooperative loans, and advances for buying vehicles. Later on, she continues, and she writes, the scheme of incentives and disincentives was not just for government employees. Unless a sterilization certificate was produced, admission to government schools was denied to the third or fourth child. Economic benefits given by the government, such as free education, medical care, allotments of agricultural land, loans at low interest rates, or a government job, were dependent on either spouse producing a certificate of sterilization. Things got so out of hand that in several Delhi government hospitals, treatment was denied until the patient first agreed to sterilization or produced a certificate stating that he or she had fewer than 3 children. Stop quote. And needless to say, there was a large amount of violence. Again, another para by Kumi Kapoor where she writes, between August and December 1976, there had been at least 8 instances of firing by the police to deal with the law and order situation because of resistance to the family planning drive. Violence broke out in Gorakhpur, Muzaffarnagar, Rampur, Bareilly, Pipli, and Pratapgarh. 12 people died in police firing in Gorakhpur, Muzaffarnagar, and Pratapgarh alone. Pipli. Pipli is a village in Haryana. And this is, chilling passages where Kapoor describes what happened. She writes, Pipli, a village in Haryana 45 kilometers north of Delhi, became the epicenter of a major riot. The agitation was triggered off by the death of a widower, Hawa Singh, who had been forcibly taken for sterilization. His surgical incision turned septic, his wound festered, and he bled to death. Even after Hawa Singh's death, the block development officer in charge was unrelenting. He returned to the village demanding more sterilization volunteers. A man repairing shoes by the roadside was forcibly picked up. Furious with such high handed and careless behavior, the villagers drove the BDO and his men out of the village after a scuffle. Hearing of the plight of the Pipli village, people from neighboring areas, including in Punjab and UP, assembled at Pipli in a show of solidarity and in defense of the authorities. Retaliation was swift and brutal. Several hundred policemen arrived along with the SDM and ordered all the men to come out of their homes. Police took up positions around the village, several behind mud walls that separated the houses from the fields. The siege continued through the night. At 6 a.m., shots were fired and two women making cow dung cakes outside their huts were mowed down by the bullets. A warning was sounded that if the villagers did not step out of their houses, an aircraft would be sent to bomb the whole area. Trembling and fearful, the men had little option but to surrender. Eventually, out of a population of 2761, between 400 and 500 men were rounded up and sterilized. Right? And the horrifying thing about this is that even if you believe that population was a problem, it would seem to you that, hey, family planning is well intentioned and all of that. But what is the intrinsic message being sent out by the state? The intrinsic message being sent out by the state is that you do not own your bodies. Something as fundamental as that, which is worse than slavery. And yet it was so normalized. And by the way, family planning continues to this day. And to this day, across India, especially in rural India, incentives are given to, doctors to produce sterilizations and so on. And it is all worth noting that it is always the women who suffer. It is never it's not like one man is not going to go up to another man and slap him on the back and say, chal yaar, nasbandi karwate hai. That never happens. It is always specifically the women who suffer. Now, all of this is happening through the 50s, 60s, 70s. Something really interesting happens in in the late 70s, which gives me a lot of hope. Paul Ehrlich at one point remarks, if I were a gambler, I would take even money that England will not exist in the year 2000. Right, he's writing this in the 70s, that England will not exist in the year 2000s. Right, and Paul Ehrlich, by the way, is a hero of the left even today. Even today, Ehrlich is a hero of the left. It is to be pointed out. His articles will appear in big newspapers abroad, and he has been wrong about everything in his life. Anyway, Julian Simon, a great economist, reads this sentence. And, the sentence once again is, I will bet even money that England will not exist in the year 2000. And he notices the word bet. So he gets in touch with Ehrlich, and this is a very public thing. And he says, look, you're saying population is
very public before Twitter.
Very public before Twitter. And he's saying, boss, you are saying that population is a huge problem. You are saying that the price of resources will keep shooting up. Resources will get scarce. Let's make a bet. You choose 5 resources. And you choose a period of time more than a year. And we will make a bet of, I think, $10,000, a significant amount even in those days, that I will bet that the price of all of them will go down. You can bet that they'll go up. We'll see what happens. And Ehrlich chooses 5, the 5 commodities he thinks are most likely to go down, which are copper, chromium, nickel, tin, and tungsten. Right? And the bet is made in 1980. 10 years later, in 1990, the price of oil has gone down, as you would expect, as anybody who knows Econ 101 would kind of expect, because humans are brains, not stomach. And meanwhile, the population of Delhi has in that time exploded 5 times from what it was when Ehrlich had his taxi ride, about which he is clearly lying, because in the mid 60s, Delhi wasn't that overpopulated. So it's a completely bizarre statement. But regardless, Julian Salmon wins a bet. And you would think that is the end of the matter. But no, Ehrlich goes on, and he's still, as I pointed out, a major figure. And I want to point to sort of some other sort of indicators of how everything turning out well despite these crazy prognostications that hundreds of millions of people will die, England won't exist, etc., etc. The standard of living is incomparably higher than it used to be back then. Julian Simon, in fact, his last book, which was edited and finished by Timur Kuran, your ex-professor, expounds on his earlier thesis that, if you actually look at population density and productivity, rather than population density causing poverty, it is the other way around. Part of his theory is that the industrial revolution and productivity booms, wherever they happened because the population went up. You multiply the number of games, you allow free trade, you allow voluntary exchange, and everybody benefits, right? And again, I will go back to sort of my question at the start of this episode. Why do people move to cities? In fact, if you are watching this and you are feeling, oh, what is Amit doing, and you're kind of resisting because we've all been taught population is a problem, where are you right now? If you're watching this from a city, why are you there? Isn't population density a problem for there? Why don't you work from a village? And if you are working from a village, that's great, but either you made your money in a city or you want to go to a city. It's one of those two always. So that's a little bit of my rant. Like, one, I get pissed off because this is something we were taught in school, but this is something people still believe like sheep. But if you just think about it independently for a little while, if you look at the data, if you look at the evidence, if you look at how Paul Ehrlich got absolutely everything wrong throughout his storied career, you realize that no, people are brains, not stomachs. I mean, just think about yourself. Would you say you're a burden on the planet, or would you say that you're contributing something to it? And that is a question we all need to ask ourselves. And it also makes me mad because there is so much state coercion that happens to this that we normalize. I find the very thought of the bureaucrats deciding what we can or cannot do with our bodies, politicians deciding those things, just appalling and unacceptable. And even the beautiful kitten behind us agrees with me. We are partners in this pie. And yeah, so that is kind of the end of my little spiel, a subject about which I feel deeply.
It's a great idea. It's a great subject. All of us have been invisibly taking in some of this propaganda, and almost everything that has been said in this field is incorrect. Let me come into a bunch of interesting ideas that are adjacent to this, and I think are all great fun. Okay, so step one, around the subject of population and population density being a problem, you precisely alluded to cities. I also build my intuition out of that, out of Ed Glaser's book, The Triumph of the City. The logic that we would give in an urban context, but which equally applies here, is that cities become great because of urban density. It is the urban agglomerations. It is large numbers of clever people in high proximity to each other, within short commutes with each other, both vertically and horizontally. So it's the number of people that live within 20 minutes of you. Okay, that is the greatness of a city. It's the sum total of their human capital that challenges and competes and drives you. Okay, so we, each of us, are the creature of the people that we are surrounded with. And urban density, urban agglomeration is the heart of that explosion, the flowering that takes place. It only takes place in those dense communities. If some evil government grabbed all those people and dispersed them, say 100 meters on a grid of 100-meter gaps between each person, then you would lose that urban agglomeration, you would lose that urban density. The very essence of modernity is an urban culture. It's not a rural culture. It's not the landowners machismo, the toxic masculinity. Urbanism is modern culture, and urbanism is created in dense collections of people. But precisely side by side with that, Ed Glaser tells us that story of urbanization, that it is possible to have terrible cities. So the fact that you bring a lot of people together in high density can make for terrible things. It can create conditions for crime, for slums, for difficulties in public health. So the challenge for society is to learn the ropes of how to do the state, about how to do governance, of how to make cities work. And there are different countries. New York City used to be quite a mess in the 70s. In the 70s, New York City was famous for crime and rats and cockroaches and so on. So there is a learning curve, and I don't want to minimize the challenge of getting the urban right. But I think that it is pretty clear that it can be done. Okay, that by now, all across the world, there are cities that have got their shit together, and there is a bag of knowledge.
Not just that, even cities which haven't got their shit together. For example, one of the things that I learned from Bjorn Lomborg's book, The Skeptical Environmentalist, came out in the early 2000s, is that cities also have an arc. Where London, for example, turn of the 19th century was as polluted as any Indian city today. It was a mess. It was, the overrunning sewers, and it seemed like it was overpopulated, etc., etc. But eventually, cities go through this bell curve, and eventually
Well,
they get
so
much cleaner
for
and
us as
whatever.
India, I don't want to pretend any inevitability to a bell curve.
But
It is
the
going to come out of purposive human action.
But the larger point I want to make is that everybody who is there to all of these cities, even these terrible cities,
Are better than being in a
are
village.
net migration in
No question.
cities.
No
People are
question.
voting with their feet.
No
You might
question.
say a slum in Mumbai is terrible,
It's
but
better than being in a village in
that's
UP.
why people are coming there.
No question. On that point, you're pitch perfect. Okay, so that's the first point, that dense agglomerations of humans uh, left to itself can generate a lot of difficulties. There is market failure. You need to get your public health right. You need to do urban planning for the transportation and the parks. But these are not beyond the wit of man, and these are solvable problems. The second thing I want to talk about is the coercion. There is a lot to understand from the Sanjay Gandhi period and compare and contrast three worlds. Okay, first, pre-emergency India family planning. Second, emergency India family planning. Third, Mao Zedong, Chinese Communist Party family planning. Okay, and what you see is that spectrum of violence, the spectrum of making a mistake and turning it into a disaster. So, we will argue that with the benefit of hindsight, we know that those things were largely misguided. In pre-emergency India, there was a modest extent of state coercion. In emergency India, it became terrible. The Indian emergency became subject to the whims of one or two people, and we know how dangerous it is when power gets concentrated in one or two people. Many terrible ideas become accepted because nobody has the guts to tell the dictator that you're full of it. And of course, you get China, which is way worse, with a one child policy, which was draconian beyond belief. So I think this is a great lesson on the importance of freedom, of the basics of dispersion of power, of the creation of a world where it becomes illegitimate and unacceptable for a state to interfere in the lives of its people like this. Because when states amass these kinds of powers, horrible things happen. And this comparison between the three worlds is telling. The next point I'd like to go to is around the words, uh, how coercive is a given state intervention. So you correctly started saying it would be creepy if a government tried to touch my body and say to me, I will prevent you from having children. Okay, I have no children today, but that's my goddamn birthright. If a government tried to tell me don't have children, okay, it would be a completely different place. So I feel that there is a very important dimension on top of coercion, which is how intrusive is the government coercion. There are different shades of gray of government coercion. So a government that tells a farmer in Punjab that we will not allow you to burn your field is a mild level of coercion. A government that tells a single woman that I will not allow you to do surrogacy is a different level of evil altogether. Because now you're coming close to the personal life of a person, and you have no right to interfere in the personal choices of people. Okay, so I think there's a spectrum for us to constantly think about. More generally, when we think of state intervention into society, there is one part where there are some inherent checks and balances, and that is surrounding spending money. So when a government spends money, first of all, extracting tax revenues from the people is very hard. Okay, the people get outraged, the people rebel, the people move their money out of the country, the people move their economic activities out of the country, the people dig holes in the ground and hide their wealth. Okay, people keep their money far away from the government, so it creates checks and balances. When the government tries to take money from the people, there's a natural check and balance. And so when a government spends money, again, they're just inherently in the hands of any half-witted government. There will be some thought, I'm spending 100 rupees, I'm spending 1000 rupees. What sense does it make? Because getting money is not easy. I know there's a lot of wastage. Government budgeting is a phenomenally bad thing. But ultimately, there is some check and balance because getting that money is not hard. On the other side, with government coercion, it seems to me that, there's really no limit. Governments just come up with one coercion after another, and there's no budget constraint. So neither is there a budget constraint, that the aggregate amount of coercion that you can do is limited as there is in a budget. There's no budget constraint in coercion. And that there are no fine sensibilities on the degrees of coercion. And I think this is something all of us need to wake up to much more, that we need to rebel far more against intrusive kinds of coercion that interfere in the life of the people. And this is something where we've not even begun, where there are all kinds of difficulties in how the government tries to tell us, the people of India, on how to live, and most of it is inappropriate. It's like, who are you to tell me how to live my personal life? Okay, all questions connected to having children should be the bloody business of individuals and not the business of government. So that's another dimension where we see this story working out. The next set of thoughts I would like to go into is drawing on Hannah Arendt, who teaches us that totalitarians run out of people to oppress. It's a fundamental feature of Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, tyrannical China, many other bad countries in the world. Tyranny creates hopelessness, and having a child is an act of hope. You had read two beautiful sentences by Bruce Springsteen. Okay, a child is about having another shot, but it is a moment of optimism. It's the tendrils of optimism are creeping out of your heart, and you think that maybe one wants to bring a child into the world. Authoritarian governments, authoritarian regimes create despondence, hopelessness, economic stagnation, cultural stagnation, and a culture of coercion in the society. And women and men respond to that by going on strike. So we see this over and over and over, that authoritarian and totalitarian countries suffer from severe depopulation. You see this in Putin's Russia today. By going to war in Ukraine, roughly 300,000 men have died. These are men of a reproductive age. These are 3,000 fewer men who could be part of potentially a 2% family. And this is going to be a significant factor in reshaping Russian demographics in the future. Further, about 1 million of the best and brightest of Russia has left Russia because of the mistakes of Putin in invading Ukraine. So overall, we're talking about something like 1.3 million people leaving the country, and with them go the future stream of children. The people who leave tend to be the younger ones. The older people have made their peace with the regime and are more likely to stay. So we see this over and over in history, that there are great population collapses. And by the way, these predate modern technologies of contraception. If you're wondering why I know some of these things, I have an amusing fact for you.
Kindly tell.
My PhD thesis was on fertility.
Oh, wow. Okay, tell me more.
So my PhD thesis was about was about women in Malaysia having babies. And so because of that, I read lots and lots about the fertility literature. And here is an amazing story from the fertility literature. Poland as a country is a young country. It was created out of the Treaty of Versailles. So it was a territory that was previously ruled by other kings, and the republic was born out of the Treaty of Versailles. And then immediately after that, there was a Soviet invasion, and Leon Trotsky was stopped at the edges of modern Poland. And then you got a country called Poland. But it was a very precarious life. Poland is a very unlucky country. On one side is Germany, on one side was the Soviet Union, or today's Russia. Okay, both at the time were terrible neighbors to have, and there was always this malevolent atmosphere about something is going to go bad because Germany and the Soviet Union cannot be trusted to be good neighbors. So what happened? What happened was that birth rates collapsed. So people just stopped having children. There was no modern reproductive technology.
So when hope dies,
When hope dies, you stop having children. Okay, so having children is an act of hope. You really need to be in a certain place, both inside your heart in terms of the happiness as a human being, but in your sense about the world. What kind of stress, what kind of difficulties are we going to face in the world? What kind of world are we going to bring our children into? Will there be safety? Will there be prosperity? Okay, these are very primal questions. And authoritarian governments create a dismal world. They create a world of fear, and people don't like to have children when faced with such fearful environments. And that has created baby busts again and again. And the two most important countries in the world where there have been sharp and dramatic fertility declines are Russia and China. And far from the fears of a population bomb, today we understand the damage from a population bust. When there is a dramatic deceleration in birth, when there is a dramatic decline of the fertility rate, it has many adverse impacts on society. So, in the advanced Western countries like the US or the UK, there was a long, slow decline in the total fertility rate. It was not sudden. So society got many generations to adjust to the new conditions. In China, in Soviet Russia, there was no time. Suddenly, the kids were gone. And that is very wrenching and it messes up the society. It creates periods of time, like right now, where there are just very few younger people and there are lots and lots of older people. And now you got to think about old age and the economic structure of an aging economy. Okay. So I want to push the word pensions aside. I want to push the word financial wealth aside. I just want you to think about the fundamental economic intuition of an aging country. In an aging country, there are going to be elderly people who want personal services. Okay. Uh, there's a very beautiful economic concept called Baumol's cost disease. I don't want to get sidetracked into that, just leaving things, lovely things for people to Google. Please go study Baumol's cost disease. It's just one of those great ideas in economics. Older people want nursing services, cooking services, cleaning services, okay, personal care, which can only be produced by younger people. So just think of those ratios. How many old people? How many young people? Okay, so if 10% of society is old, and for a moment, let's push the word money aside. So I'm not into pension wealth. I'm just on arithmetic. If 10 old people are adequately well funded, then they're consuming the services of, 15 young people. But if you have 40 old people, and then you want to consume the services of 60 young people, that's not feasible because other things also have to be produced. And that's the kind of difficulties that we're seeing in a country like Russia, in a country like China, where there's been abrupt aging and the number of young people available to perform those services is just not there. Okay, so anything produced by the young faces this exchange rate problem, that how many young people are available to produce it? How many old people are there to buy it? Now that trade is difficult. Think non-tradable services. How much are you going to pay? The prices basically go to infinity. And so you get very few older people who are able to rescue some modicum of prosperity and dignity in old age by buying the services from young people. Okay, so these are modern perspectives where a sudden and rapid decline in fertility is actually a curse and not a blessing. So the one-child policy was worse than a brief episode of the emergency. And thankfully, the ability of the Indian culture to reject coercion in family planning after Sanjay Gandhi led to a largely laissez-faire approach, which has blunted some of this damage. But now I want to come to the most recent period. There's been no important state coercion around family planning in India.
Actually, I wrote a column in 2014 responding to just this, where I was responding to an incident where a bunch of people died because a bunch of women died because sterilization was done in unhygienic conditions. So these sterilization camps actually still continue, by the way. But
I think they're more opt-in, they're voluntary. There's less coercion.
There's
not
less
even
coercion, but
100.
there are still those incentives in play. It's
Peanut money compared. See, for people who are looking to have children, it's an infinitely important thing. Little money here and there will not do it. You need like Chinese one-child policy misery to force people. And then, of course, you have the usual Indian incompetence of the Indian state that at a sterilization camp, sure, the autoclave will not be working, the instruments will be contaminated. That's garden variety incompetence of the Indian state. That's unsurprising. But I'm just commenting that the level of coercion has gone down.
No, by that point,
100x, 1000x.
China is the worst,
compared to
Sanjay was bad.
1976.
We're not that bad now.
Yeah.
However,
We are now facing a different problem. The last official census in India was 2011. I had to break the bad news to you, Virginia, if you believed that the Indian census was gospel truth. It's not. It's a messy, difficult project. Indian census data is okay. Was okay. It was not perfect. Uh, there are some wonderful researchers who've been telling stories about how the census was used to draw electoral maps. So, Indian style gerrymandering is not about how the constituencies are painted, but about manipulating the census. And this has been going on for a while. So, census data in India has never been great. But we only have 2011 census data. We don't have a 2021 census. As far as we can tell, there's no census going on around us. So we don't know when there'll be a census. We don't know whether some people will be afraid of giving their data to a census investigator. So there is a bit of a mess in India in terms of measurement. Because of the usual difficulties of the Indian government-run statistical system. Okay, so again, I don't want to single out the census. Lots of government statistics work badly. The Indian GDP is not measured correctly. Okay, so the Indian Index of Industrial Production is not measured correctly. The NSSO works poorly. The ASI works poorly. The census works poorly. I don't want to single it out. All I want to say is we don't have very sound data. We do have a bunch of alternative sources of information which are telling us that actually there is quite a dramatic decline in fertility taking place in India all around us. And it is happening at a pretty rapid rate. And I, for one, am starting to get a little concerned that there is a problem. And then you scratch under the surface and you wonder why. And then I'll just turn to the same basic question, that what is the moral universe of men and women choosing to have children? What is the cosmology? What is the optimism that they see? Do they see jobs? Do they see freedom? Do they see safety? Or do they see a grim, troubled world where there is social strife, an ever interfering state, and poor economic prospects? These are the factors that shape the fertility choices of young people. The failure of our urban environment has made life very difficult for would-be parents, where urban residential accommodation is very cramped and you suffer a long commute to go to work, and it's difficult to organize yourselves to bring up children. So these are all factors that shape the rational decisions of people to have children. And I am starting to get increasingly concerned that there is a significant problem in India in terms of a rather rapid decline in fertility rates in the last 10 years, 15 years. And this could easily turn into a significant threat to the way the Indian society is organized in the future. I just want to link up to two more aspects in that. One problem is the imbalance between the number of men and number of women. So the number of women are the choke point in determining normal heteronormative two-person family organized to have children. And the second problem around the nuptiality process is the social thumb rule that young people have to first have a job before they will get married. And the state of employment in India is quite bad. So many young men and women just go into their 20s for years without having the ability to have a livelihood. And that leads to a crimping of nuptiality and delays in marriage. And all this is part of what is feeding into the difficulties in terms of having children. And finally, I just want to start bringing up tough questions that we in India need to start thinking about. That having more children is a good thing for individuals if they should choose to do so. And government interventions should not limit or intrude the ability of people to have children. And we should not tie ourselves around heteronormative family concepts. So I feel that many aspects of the rules of the game of society need to change in favor of more eclectic and unconventional ways for people to have and raise children. And the more that is done, it would be a good thing. It would reflect the blossoming of human freedom. And also it would be practical in a country where, as I say, I think there's a significant problem shaping up in terms of the number of children.
I feel like you've just given me, a masterclass in what was your PhD subject, fertility and population, and in a sense, India. And does it then become like, it seems to me that it then becomes a bit like a vicious circle? That what you point out happening in Russia and China, for example, especially Russia today, yeah, or Poland in those dark years, that you lose hope. And because you lose hope, you're not having so many kids, and the country gets older and older. And because there aren't enough young people coming up, there is less cause for hope. So where will hope come from then? And it can be a deep descent when that happens.
It's a scary environment. Just layer on top of this what the Chinese call the bare branches problem, where there are young men who, are just not finding their feet well into their 20s, who have a moral universe which is just a bit of a catastrophe. No amount of government dole is a substitute for standing on your own feet and learning a trade and developing an income, moving out, building a family, living independently. All these wonderful things are denied to young men today because of the overall failures of high economic growth in India. And that has enormous social and political consequences going forward. And it is interconnected to the problem of children. So, men without women is a problem. Men without children is a problem. Heteronormative family concepts that only a father and a mother can bring up a child. Once you start doing that, you're narrowing many, many people who might otherwise have been quite happy to be single parents. But the way Indian society and a great deal of state coercion is structured, all that is cut off.
I sometimes provocatively say that most Urdu poetry is the whining of incels, but that is just a provocation. But the whining of incels could kind of become a problem. One sort of stark image that stays with me is not something I saw, but it's a stark image painted by a friend of mine, Kumar Anand, was when he was traveling through Bihar near Saharsa, which is a town where he lives. And he said that he would go out in Bihar, in semi-urban Bihar, and he would see that the streets were full of young men standing. And they're not standing waiting for a bus, they're not standing at a katta having a cigarette or whatever. They're not standing waiting for someone, a contractor, to come and pick them up in a truck to take them away. They're just standing. They're just idle. And and it was a haunting image the way he described it. And recently I did an episode on Bihar with two of my friends, Mohit Satyanand and Kumar himself, who went on a road trip through Bihar. And a lot of what they describe is exactly that. It is young people who either don't have jobs or who don't even care anymore. There is just that loss of hope. And when you are like that, what kids are you going to have? What dreams are you going to have? A family and that kind of life. So it's kind of terribly sad.
Our friend Renuka Sane has a co-authored paper on sex ratios and crime. And her co-author and Renuka have an interesting identification strategy that is buzzwords for a nice paper. Have an interesting identification strategy where they find that when the sex ratio goes more in the direction of excess males, then you start getting increases in crime also.
Yeah, and which ties in with which ties in with neuroscience also. Like one of the big TILs I learned about neuroscience was, I think it was probably Robert Sapolsky on an episode of Sam Harris's podcast. I might be misremembering, but basically, in males, the part of the brain that is responsible for socialization only develops fully by 25, which is why most violence in the world is by young males between the ages of 18 to 25, and after that things kind of settle down. And there, if you have the gender balance also going out of whack,
and also gender segregation. Okay, so nature and nurture work together. When young males in India are brought up without talking to girls, it is deeply damaging because there is just it's a dagger wound on the soul.
I went to a boys' school. I learned how to talk to girls by watching Bollywood, which is not quite the best thing, is it? But there we go. So, this has been so depressing. Our demographic dividend is a demographic disaster. But I want to kind of entertain you with an exchange of letters between two great men, two great economists, certainly two heroes of mine, and I'm sure of yours also, which will entertain you and all our listeners, all our gentle readers. I'm sorry, gentle readers. So, the two people I'm referring to are Julian Simon, of course, why not? The ultimate resource man, the winner of the Ehrlich Simon bet, and Milton Friedman. right? So I'm going to start out first by reading a letter from 1976. To be precise, December 23, 1976, Julian Simon writes to Milton Friedman, and he's writing about the Civil Aeronautics Board, the CAB. So he writes, the CAB is now considering a variety of plans to deal with airline overbooking. There is, however, a plan that is better for everyone, that leaves every passenger satisfied and allows the airlines to make more money than at present. This is the overbooking auction plan. The scheme is as follows. If more ticketed passengers show up than there are seats, each passenger writes a sealed bid of the lowest amount he or she is willing to accept in return for waiting until the specified next flight. The low bidders are given the amounts bid and they take the next flight satisfied. All other passengers fly as scheduled, satisfied. The airlines can overbook to a higher degree than now and without complaint. They too would be satisfied. I am writing to you and 8 or 10 others because it might help if an ex-president or two of the American Economic Association in his private capacity indicated to the CAB that the scheme represents respectable economic opinion and is not the work of a crank. Right? So Julian Simon at this point, a young economist, Milton Friedman is of course Milton Friedman. On January 18, 1977, Milton Friedman replied to Julian Simon. Here's what he wrote. Your plan does make a great deal of sense to me, as to every economist. At the same time, I am unwilling to write to the chairman of CAB to this effect. I am not an expert in the aircraft industry and have not made a serious investigation of the overbooking problem. If the plan is as good as you and I think it is, I am utterly baffled by the unwillingness of one or more of the airlines to experiment with it. I conclude that we must be overlooking something. I realize that you have tested this quite exhaustively, and I have no reason to question your results, yet I find it even harder to believe that opportunities for large increments of profit are being rejected for wholly irrational reasons. Stop quote. I mean, thereby basically saying that, look, if it was such a good idea, they would have done it already. A week later, on January 25th, 1977, Julian Simon replies, maybe you're right and I'm overlooking something, but if there really is something being overlooked, the letters from airlines don't mention it. They just talk about collusion and administrative practicality. Right? Now, an interesting thing happens. A gentleman named Alfred E. Kahn is appointed head of the CAB, and he's an economist. And he's a good economist because not all economists get economics, but he's a good economist. He gets it. And then gradually, the airlines figure out what a great idea, they implement it. I believe it is standard practice even today. And then eventually, Julian Simon in 1979 writes to Milton Friedman, and this is on July 31st, and he writes, I'm one of your great fans, and I'm not an I told you so type. Still, you may find it interesting to compare your second and third paragraphs in your letter of January 18, 1977 with American Airlines experience as described in the enclosed letter and memo. And now he quotes the American Airlines where they said, we have been very pleased with the results of our voluntary approach to denied hoardings. Stop quote. And then Julian Simon continues, if bureaucratic inertia is irrational, then it seems clear that the only barrier to innovation here was indeed irrational. Now, you might imagine Milton Friedman, a great man, might kind of get offended, and this is like an I told you so. But on September 26th of that year, Milton Friedman replies to him, short, pithy letter. He says, many thanks for your I told you so. You are entitled to it. You deserve a great deal of credit for having pushed your idea as effectively as you have. Stop quote. And I love this because these are great people. These are great people having a dialogue. And these are great people having a dialogue without ego coming into it. Like in today's age where everything is so polarized, where, you're so concerned about being wrong on social media, being wrong in public. Here's Milton Friedman writing to this young economist saying, I was wrong. You were right. Well done. You deserve credit. It's such a beautiful story. So, Ajay, that time has come. You have to recommend, and you have to recommend a book at least. You're welcome to recommend other things, but at least a book. So, what's your book for the day?
I recommend, I mentioned Hannah Arendt, one of the great thinkers of the 20th century. Uh, Everybody should go rummage around her life and her world. She was an interesting person. She was one of the first people to show us the harsh realities and connections between the evils of totalitarianism of both kinds. So, whether you do nationalist socialism, Nazi Germany, or you do communist Russia, Stalin's Russia, there are so many characteristics of the two kinds of regimes that are the same. And sadly, those lessons are rich with meaning for all of us as we observe the world today. So, to understand authoritarian regimes, Hannah Arendt is an important guide. Her fundamental book of this nature is The Origins of Totalitarianism.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I would again add to that that the book was written decades ago, but it's not a book of history, it's a book of the present moment.
And Amit, what are your recommendations for us today?
So my recommendation is a book that happens to be here. It's a book called Yuganta by Iravati Karve. This is a masterpiece. I don't know what I can say about it. It made me understand my society, my world, my culture much better than I had. It made me look at all of this with a critical eye. You know, it has a beautiful examination of our epics and the role of women in them, and some of it makes for very disquieting, disturbing reading. But I think it's essential. It is. It's a great book of literary criticism, number one, because what it is looking at is what it is looking at and analyzing are these epics of ours. But it is also, a book about society. And just like Hannah Arendt's book isn't just a book of history, I think the analysis of society that Iravati Karve's Yuganta does, it's not an analysis of another time and space. It's an analysis of this time and this age as well. You know, we still live in that world.
I think the book is 1936. I got it in 1994. It was a memorable experience. I totally second this.